What's up, everybody? This isn't necessarily a book review, but I'm gonna be talking about East of Eden. So, yeah. The reason it's because I feel like this book is just it's so talked about, and I feel like everybody's read it. Where a book review doesn't warrant a book review because I feel like any thoughts I have about it, while they may be original, somewhat they've been echoed already by people 10 times smarter than me and people who have more knowledge and insight. But I do want to talk about a specific, not theme per se, but like an element in the book. And that element is death and just how characters die in the book, which I found pretty interesting. For context, I finished this book, I want to say, about like 3 weeks ago, and I finished it in not like a rough time in my life, but in a time in my life where I wasn't, probably at my happiest or things like that. So I think the ending, kind of stuck with me. I think the whole theme of Tim Shell and free will and living your life away from anything you've done before is pretty important, but I'm not going to talk about that because, again, everybody's already talked about that. What I do want to talk about is death. And I think that John Steinbeck, read that. He writes about the character's death in two ways, and I think the two ways are, one is they die suddenly, and there's maybe a sentence of actual acknowledgement of death, and then he the next chapters are about how the characters deal with that death and how they react to it. And then the other way that he goes really into in depth about death, about some characters. So yeah, one of the examples is Tom, or not Tom, Aaron. Yeah, we see Aaron. Well, we don't know it's Aaron, but we see someone enlist, and then the book goes on. Charles and Cal eventually realize that Aaron did enlist, that he lied about his age, but he's still there. And Adam, who had, I think, yeah, he just had a stroke, so he's kind of going. And then finally, at the end of chapter 54 and the start of 55, we learn, and Cal learns, and Lee too, that Aaron died. And so it's really kind of striking because you're just like, damn, okay, Aaron is just gone now. He's died. And then we see there isn't really a lot of the book left to grapple with it, but we see how Cal feels responsible for it because he showed Aaron their mother's whorehouse. So that's part of it. And Adam has a stroke, presumably by the news, so he can't really deal with it per se. But that's just one of the examples how John Steinbeck kind of uses the sudden death. Another example is Tom, who is one of Sam Hamilton's sons, and you know Desi, who he was living with, dies of appendicitis, and now Tom, kind of racked with guilt, kills himself. It's not as sudden because the latter half of the chapter kind of alludes to it, and we can see Tom's preparation to kill himself, but it kind of just happens, and the end page is that he was a gallant man, and then you don't really hear from Tom at all. There isn't any more mention of him. Yeah. Adam and Charles's dad is another example. Charles gets the news, and then they kind of deal with it, and then Adam and Charles kind of have this whole argument where Charles kind of is unaware, or not unaware, but he's really confused about how their dad had this much money, and he's kind of like racked with suspicion, and how, because he always wanted his father's approval and love, and he never got it. And so now that he's dead with all this money, he can't help but be like suspicious and sad about it. Whereas Adam kind of just says, I don't care about the money, or I don't care about the means of how he got his money. He probably stole it, and he just doesn't really care. And like the death itself kind of happens, and then John Steinbeck writes about the death, and the characters deal with it. Similarly, Charles dies pretty suddenly, and gets known through a letter, and he gets all the money. And obviously, Charles's will includes that Adam and his wife Kathy get the money, and Adam obviously knows Kathy is alive, and that leads to a whole different series of events. So those are just some examples. I think they're the only examples I thought of how of sudden death and how the characters deal with it. Now, on the other side is three deaths that I think are written about really in depth, and with them dying, the whole scene of them dying is pretty drawn out. I think probably the best example is Kathy. She, in her dying breath, she thinks about Alice in Wonderland and how they would have been friends as she's taking her pills, and she starts thinking back about on her life, and how she always kind of felt different, but that she was always in control, and so that it takes up a good amount where she can talk, and you really feel connected to Kathy in her last moments. Another example of this kind of drawn out death is Sam Hamilton. Obviously, Sam Hamilton plays a really big part in the whole story. You know, he dies, and it has a different effect on everybody. Lee and Adam were close to them, and Sam basically gave Aaron and Charles, or not, Aaron and Cal their names, even though they took nicknames, which he said was a sign of a bad name. So you could talk about that a little bit. But through Sam's death, he dies, but he lives on through the actions of Adam and Lee. And Lee, he like mentions Sam Hamilton every now and then, but you can see his influence on Adam as a father, trying to not be his father, who only loved one of them. And the whole Hamilton family really takes a backdrop later in the latter half of this book, as Adam and his family and his sons, are the focus of the book as you go on. But that's just an example of how Sam Hamilton's life and his ideas influence them. But yeah, that is just, what I think about some of the deaths in East of Eden. It's a really good book. Probably one of my favorite books. So I had time to brew on it, and I didn't want to make like a review of the book because, like, what am I going to say? It's a really good book. It stuck with me. But I think death was pretty interesting on how it was portrayed out. But yeah, thank you.